Forget every painting you've ever seen of Agincourt. This was not a battle won by arrows, but by mud, gravity, and the terrifying physics of human compression. Imagine 80 pounds of steel armor turning into a coffin, and the weight of your own comrades driving the air from your lungs. This is the truth of Agincourt, and how 7,000 men were suffocated by their own friends. To understand this impossible slaughter, you must first understand the battlefield. The English army did not march toward glory, they stumbled toward an executioner. For weeks, every single step was a fight against the ground itself, a desperate, gut-wrenching retreat across a hostile land that was rapidly drowning in late autumn rain. This ragged corps of perhaps 6,000 men, weakened by dysentery, starving, and exhausted, was cornered near the village of Agincourt. King Henry V of England, a king on the run, now faced the entire, gathering might of the French kingdom, a force that numbered at minimum 30,000 fighting men, armed with the finest plate armor Europe could offer. Henry's only salvation was the geography itself. The field was a funnel, perhaps 1,000 yards wide, bordered on both sides by dense, deep forest. This configuration was crucial, as it meant the enormous French force, which relied on its sweeping flanks to crush smaller armies, would have to attack head-on. Their numbers would be their burden, not their strength. Furthermore, the ground was recently plowed farmland, and the heavy autumn rains had transformed the earth into a heavy, glue-like clay. This thick, sucking mire was the silent Third Army joining the English cause. The French, relying on their devastating dismounted charges, would have to haul perhaps 80 pounds of steel armor through ankle-deep sludge before they even reached the English lines. The tactical realization was simple. The French armor, the very symbol of their terrifying power, was about to become an impossible weight, a heavy, gilded cage in a field of mud. It was a field of death chosen by a king who had no other choice. Henry knew a conventional defense would fail. His primary force was comprised of perhaps 5,000 longbowmen. These archers were not meant for close-quarters combat against heavy knights. Henry positioned his archers not just as missile troops, but as a crucial defensive barrier, driving sharpened wooden stakes, known as palings, into the ground diagonally in front of their positions. This prepared line, impossibly thin against the French host, was the entirety of the English defense. Henry's strategy depended on the French viewing it as a prize to be seized, not a fortress to be overcome. The day passed in a grim stalemate. The French, confident in their numbers, refused to attack, waiting for the starving English to surrender or attempt to flee. Henry, knowing that time was his true enemy, was forced to act. In the early morning hours of October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, Henry gave the order that decided the battle before the first arrow flew. The English army would not wait. They would advance. This final move was designed to pull the French into the engagement, drawing them forward into the kill zone of the narrow field, exactly where the mud and the forest would do their terrible work. The French princes, seeing the English advance, finally took the bait. The English had survived the long, grinding retreat and successfully maneuvered their massive, confident enemy into a geographical choke point designed for slaughter. But all of this was mere preparation. The French nobles, heavy in their pride and even heavier in their shining armor, were now beginning to stir in the mud. They were about to make a tactical decision that turned their protective steel into a gilded prison. The French camp was a carnival of noble arrogance, a loud, chaotic market of chivalry and misplaced confidence. Hundreds of banners, embroidered with the elaborate coats of arms of dukes and counts, flapped over thousands of silk-lined pavilions. Before the battle, the French command had not been debating strategy. They had been arguing over who would have the honor of capturing the English king. They had already drawn lots for the rich spoils of Henry's camp, convinced that the surrender was a mere hour away. This hubris was more dangerous than any English weapon. The French nobles, driven by personal glory rather than disciplined strategy, rushed to take their places in the front ranks. The traditional tactical wisdom of the day called for the first wave to be manageable, allowing room for maneuver, but the sheer volume of high-ranking Frenchmen ensured the front line was instantly overcrowded. They crammed their men-at-arms, the cream of their heavily armored fighting force, into the narrow funnel of the field until the men stood shoulder to shoulder, sometimes 3 deep where there should have been 1. Worse than the crowding was the decision that would seal their fate. The nobles insisted on dismounting their heavy cavalry. They were not going to charge on horseback like barbarians. They would fight on foot, like true, valiant knights. This choice meant that men, often wearing 60 to 80 pounds of custom-fitted plate steel designed to repel swords and lances, were now standing stationary in a recently ploughed field soaked through by an all-night rain. Every single knight was encased in what was essentially a golden, personalized prison. This was a choice rooted in aristocratic pride, and it would immediately murder the men who made it. If you're finding this history as gripping as the events themselves, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us dive deep into these stories that truly changed the world. The armor itself, the harness, was a marvel of the age. It was a beautiful, functional shield of articulated steel, but it carried a deadly secret. It made men entirely reliant on level, firm ground. Now, sinking into the ankle-deep sludge of the French soil, that reliance became a crippling vulnerability. The ground sucked at their sabatons and their greaves, demanding enormous energy for every single step. The nobles, obsessed with the impending glory, failed to realize the basic physics of the situation. Their sheer numbers were creating a terrifying pressure cooker. When the first line moved, the second line, unable to see the condition of the ground, would inexorably follow and press forward. The French were not simply an army, they were a giant, self-propelled mass of 5,000 tons of human compression waiting to happen. The weight of their own comrades, driven by blind confidence from the rear, would prove far more lethal than the 6-foot length of an English arrow. As the English began their methodical, desperate advance toward the French lines, the French nobles finally committed their men. The front ranks of the men-at-arms began their march, an intimidating wall of steel moving with agonizing slowness through the clinging mud. The immense physical strain began immediately. Just walking was an exhausting workout, and the heat trapped inside the sealed metal suits began to rapidly drain their energy reserves. They were expending the energy of a full battle before they had even crossed a quarter of the field. The French leaders, gazing upon the thin, ragged line of the English army, saw only a formality to be completed, a prize to be collected. They had forfeited all their tactical advantage, their numbers, their cavalry, and the protective quality of their armor to the collective spirit of aristocratic pride. Every minute they spent struggling through the mud was a minute the English archers spent waiting, their longbows ready to unleash the biblical plague that would turn the heavily armored French knights from disciplined warriors into a panicking, suffocating herd. The English line, static and professional, waited until the moment of maximum French commitment. Henry V himself is said to have led his small corps of men-at-arms, but the true action was about to come from the flanks, where the archers stood ready. The signal was given, and the air filled with the terrifying rhythmic thrum of 5,000 longbow strings being simultaneously released. The mud had set the stage for the defeat. Now, the arrows would begin to drive the French into their own trap. The sound was not a chime of heroic steel, but a deafening, splintering roar, the sound of thousands of wooden shafts vibrating through the air before impacting bone, mail, and wood. This was the opening move, the prelude to the true slaughter, and it was executed with machine-like precision. The English archers did not fire arrows, they fired a deluge. Trained from boyhood, capable of firing 10 to 12 shots per minute, the 5,000 longbowmen launched at least 50,000 projectiles in the first 5 minutes alone. The French nobles had expected to be lightly bruised, but the longbow, the terror weapon of the age, was designed to exploit the weak points of plate armor, targeting the armpits, the eye slits, and the joints where mobility demanded compromise. The initial casualties were horrific. Horses, panicked and unarmored, were instantly shredded and became obstacles in the mud. Knights were wounded in the joints, their thick plate now pinning them in place, or struck in the face, blinding or incapacitating them. But the arrows were not intended to be the primary killer. The shafts were the herd drivers, the chaotic, painful force designed to introduce panic into the massive, slow-moving French column. As the French front line took the full force of the arrow storm, their discipline shattered. Wounded men screamed, blinded men stumbled, and the instinct to flee or simply get out of the way overwhelmed any semblance of command. But in the 1,000-yard-wide funnel created by the woods, there was nowhere to go but forward. The rear ranks, still advancing under the momentum of their own immense numbers, could not see the horror unfolding at the front. They could only hear the panicked cries and the agonizing thud of the arrow storm. As the pressure built from behind, the already overcrowded front ranks were compressed further. They were no longer soldiers advancing on command, but a clogged river of steel forced into a narrow channel. The mud was now exacting its deadly price. A knight who fell forward, whether wounded or merely tripped, was utterly lost. Encased in 80 pounds of steel, he could not use his limbs to push himself back up. The suction of the clay held him fast. He was a piece of debris, and the river of men behind him simply flowed over him. The archers, seeing the effect of their fire, began to advance with their entire line, pulling up their palings and driving them back into the new ground, constantly tightening the choke point. The arrows were just forcing the French to commit the worst atrocity of the day, killing each other. The English were now no longer fighting the French army. They were fighting the physics of the French army. Every brave man pushing from the second or third rank was unknowingly signing the death warrant of the man immediately in front of him. The French charge did not break through the English lines, it simply slammed into itself. The moment of contact when the front ranks finally reached the English men-at-arms was not a glorious clash, but a sound of shocking, heavy compression. The English soldiers, fresh and fighting on relatively stable ground, met an enemy who was already drowning in exhaustion and pressure. The archers, having delivered their deluge, dropped their bows, seized their axes, mallets, and even their own wooden palings, and poured into the flanks of the immobilized French mass. The French formation, rigid and heavy, cracked under the pressure from within and the swift, violent assault from without. It was time for the true, horrifying engine of death to begin its work. The battle was not won by the sword, it was won by the sheer weight of the French nobility. When the thousands of armored Frenchmen collided, the forces at work were tectonic. The sheer momentum, driven by the rear ranks, meant that the men at the very front had their ribs pressed against the backs of their breastplates. They could not swing a weapon, could not step back, and most crucially, they could not draw a full breath. This was the moment the French armor turned from a shield into a claustrophobic torture chamber. The mud amplified the horror. Any man who stumbled lost all leverage. He instantly became a horizontal obstacle, and the men behind him, unable to stop or change course, were pressed onto him. The accounts of the battle are clear. The dead were not standing. They were piled up in layers, bodies crushed, their helmets driven into their breasts. The primary cause of death was not the arrow, nor the English axe, but asphyxiation. Imagine being sealed inside a metal box, fighting an uphill battle in deep mud while 1,000 men behind you push with all their strength. The air inside the helmet quickly grew hot, humid, and stale. The sheer pressure made the simple act of exhaling and inhaling a violent struggle. Men who were perfectly healthy minutes before began to slowly, agonizingly suffocate, their lungs starved of oxygen, their faces purple against the cold steel of their helms. The English did not need to fight them. They simply needed to hold the line and let the French army kill itself. The sight was utterly unlike any conventional battle. The English archers, armed with their rough, crude weapons, now worked the edges of the matted French mass like butchers at a slaughterhouse. They had learned to exploit the fallen, driving daggers into the exposed armpits, groin, or the thin plating at the base of the skull. The French men-at-arms, trapped in their 60-pound cages, were unable to even lift their weapons to defend themselves against these lighter, faster opponents who were running across the mounds of their dying comrades. The battle became a meat grinder, powered by French arrogance and physics. The muffled screams of the suffocating men were horrific, trapped inside the thick metal casings. The pressure was so intense that some knights, still standing, were completely immobilized, unable to fight or flee, reduced to crying out desperate, muffled pleas. King Henry V himself fought in this horrific crush, his armor dented, his helmet taking a severe blow, but his disciplined center line held fast. The archers, having performed brilliantly, had now demonstrated that the heavy French armor was not a defense against common death, but a guarantee of a gruesome one. After perhaps 2 hours of this impossible, claustrophobic crush, the first ranks of the French collapsed into a mass of mangled, suffocated dead and dying. The bodies formed a literal, bloody rampart, forcing the second and third French waves to climb over their own comrades just to engage the English. The English were now standing on a mound of the French dead, fighting downhill, completely fresh compared to their oxygen-starved, exhausted opponents. The remaining French forces finally broke, their aristocratic pride dissolving into a desperate scramble for survival. The invincible army had not been defeated. It had been compressed and drowned in the mud by its own weight. The sound of steel was replaced by the terrified squelch of men pulling their feet from the clay. The battle was over. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. To keep the conversation going, please leave a comment below, telling us which forgotten battlefield you want to see explored next, and share this video with another history enthusiast. The silence that followed the French rout was thick, sudden, and terrifying. It was broken only by the sound of the wind, the heavy, ragged breathing of the exhausted English, and the gurgling, dying sighs of the men trapped beneath the suffocated piles. The English surveyed the scene, and the true, gruesome nature of their victory was revealed. Thousands of French knights lay heaped upon one another, their bodies tangled in the thick, viscous mud. The sheer, overwhelming majority of them had not been killed by English weapons. They had died from the implacable logic of physics, suffocation, crush injuries, and drowning in the muck while trapped by their armor. This was not a military defeat, it was an industrial accident of medieval scale. The statistics are staggering, underscoring the lethal power of compression. Of the French dead estimated between 7,000 and 10,000, fewer than 10% of the French dead were killed by direct weaponry. The rest were claimed by the ground and the press. The vast majority were found pressed into the clay, their helmets sealed by the pressure, their faces frozen in the agonizing moment of trying to draw a last, impossible breath. The victory was so complete that it created a horrifying logistical problem: what to do with the thousands of high-ranking French prisoners. Henry V, seeing large remaining French forces lingering on the horizon and fearing a counterattack that could exploit his tired, outnumbered force, made the controversial, chilling decision to execute the bulk of his prisoners. This was not a moment of glory, but of grim, terrified pragmatism. The scale of the French collapse demanded a cruel, immediate solution to secure the English survival. Henry's weary, triumphant army eventually continued its march to Calais, having not only survived the trap, but having used it to turn the age's greatest military advantage, heavy armor, and massed numbers, into a colossal liability. The English casualties were minimal, numbering in the low hundreds, a ratio so shocking it rewrote the rules of warfare forever. The enduring lesson of Agincourt is not simply the triumph of the longbow over the knight, but the triumph of discipline and terrain over hubris and weight. The French nobles, driven by their individual pride to crowd the battlefield and dismount in the mud, sealed their fate. They turned their magnificent armor, the symbol of their prestige, into a golden, immobile tomb. The Battle of Agincourt proved that the future of warfare did not belong to the solitary, chivalric hero encased in steel, but to the disciplined foot soldier who understood tactics and geometry. The mud, the choke point, and the resulting human compression were the true engines of Henry V's victory. It was a day when the ground itself swallowed the flower of French nobility, leaving behind a lesson that echoes across the centuries. Sometimes, the greatest killer on the battlefield is not the enemy's weapon, but the terrible, suffocating physics of your own mass. If you were gripped by the horrifying truth behind this famous battle, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next deep dive into the incredible moments that shaped our world. And while you're here, leave a comment letting us know your thoughts on Agincourt, and share this story to bring more history lovers into the discussion.